So I'm gonna talk about modeling the electric field for TMS and TDCS. So try to only give a very short introduction what those methods are, and then try to show you some demos of our software. And we just like set it up on this laptop, like, literally like half an hour before the talk. So I hope everything will work. Just very quickly, so what is TMS? TMS stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's like a technique for neural stimulation, so how to stimulate not in a non-invasive way the brain. And it works by putting a magnetic coil somewhere on your head, usually over the target area that you tend to excite, and there's like a time-varying magnetic field that rapidly switches on and off, and that induces an electric current or electric field in your brain. Electric fields are pretty strong for TMS. They're really about like 100 millivolts per millimeter. That's strong enough to depolarize neural membranes and cause actual potentials. For example, if you put it over the motor cortex, it can make your finger twitch, for example. It's like one of the most commonly used areas. And that is like the big advantage. It has a directly measurable output, for example, motor evoked potentials or fast means which you can impute. Another method that is, say, gaining more popular now is using electric stimulation by applying electric currents to electrodes directly attached to the head, which is in the case of direct currents, it's called TDCS. Can also use, people are starting to use alternating currents, it would be called TACS. Electric fields are much weaker for those methods. They're really about 100 times weaker than TMS, and they have more subtle effects. And usually you apply them for a longer time, for example, for 10 minutes, apply this weak current, and it also has been shown that their lasting effects are probably driven by also shifting membrane potentials a little bit around. But the effect of TDCS are usually not directly measurable, just like as you have in TMS, but more like by comparing like pre and post stimulation effects. So how are we usually targeting brain areas with those methods? In the case of TMS, what is really state of the art that you have an anatomical image, anatomic MR image of the subject, maybe even have an fMRI image with activation focus. And they're commercially available neuronavigation softwares that basically track the TMS coil and the subject's head in real time. So this frameless stereotaxic system. And it says, yeah, position the coil at that spot and you're gonna hit a certain brain region. But there are basically two problems with this commonly used neuronavigation system. Basically, they use spherical models to estimate the stimulation focus. And our brain, I think, is not a sphere. So like the estimate that they make is probably not the best one. And also, brain is anisotropic, what we, for example, can measure with DTI. The diffusion is inhomogeneous, and same is also for conduction of currents. And those are things that are commercially available packages are not taking into account at the moment. But the electric field distribution, which is like widely accepted, that is like the driving factor of effects in TMS and TDCS, we can just simply compute them. So the equations that you have to solve is like for TMS electric field, and it's like here, I don't know if it's that. That is just determined by the rate of change of the coil current. That's like this first term, so how strongly basically a current changes, and it's also determined by the shape, by the geometric shape of the coil. What is most common is like a so-called figure of 8 coil. We have like two wire loops, the current, which then create like a more focal electric field beneath, but they also, for example, use round coils or many different type of coils. That's like the first term, and the other term is then is the gradient of the electric potential at different tissue interfaces, for example, between the skull and the CSF, or between white matter and gray matter. There's an accumulation of charges that will create a so-called secondary electric field. For the case of TDCS, it's a bit easier that you basically only have this charge accumulation with the boundary conditions of your electrodes. So the physics of that is actually not too complicated, and there are many different ways to numerically solve those equations. Basically, what is important that what you compute there is like realistic, or it's like has like any application for real experiment. It's like basically how well your head model is, how well your model describes, say, the experiment reality. And basically, most of my, say, career so far in grad school and also now further is like developing those models and trying to validate them and further improve them and see how they can be useful in experimental research. So why do I think those computational models for TMS and TDCS are useful? One is like they can really help in interpreting experimental results. So if you know which brain areas are actually stimulated or to what certain extent you can maybe relate your experimental results with respect to model outcomes, they can largely help in improving your experimental methods. And for example, in the case of TDCS, like new montages have been suggested just based on modeling. And also another big point is, say, individual variability. I think that's like one of the main issues in non-invasive brain stimulation. It works, but it somehow works different between different persons. And some of those might be just related how, for example, electric fields spread. Someone might have a larger head or like a thicker skull, and that leads that there are different electric fields will be applied during those methods. And like some of this variability might be possibly explained with those models. So how are we creating them is that we use anatomical images and segment them, automate it, and create different tissues. We also have, like on our homepage, the program, which I'm going to describe later, is called simnips.org. It stands for Simulation of Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation. We also have suggested anatomical sequences that we have been tested and are particularly good to give a good automated segmentation, for example, of white matter and gray matter. Skull is like probably like the most tricky part, because it doesn't give a direct signal in most MR sequences, so we kind of estimate it indirectly between CSF and skull. And then we create what they call so-called finite element head model, and I'm going to show you in a minute. We can also use conductivity anisotropy in our simulations, and you can indirectly estimate it from diffusion tensor imaging. There have been some studies that related basically conductivity tensor to the diffusion tensor, based on the assumption that both processes are kind of guided by the same, say, boundaries, where like diffusion and conduction takes place. And there are some approaches to estimate this as well. We have like a free open source software, SimNips, which has like been started now nearly 5 years ago, and which I'm now trying to demo a little bit. So Dave, can I go to the
which one is this?
Yeah. So once when you run the software, you can create a 3D head model. What you're gonna see here. So that's what you can see here. So this is like yeah, made off of like different tissues. You see here. So that was like a kind of special case one where we looked at different skull layers. So that's why optimized for TDCS. Like the skull has different layers: compact bone, spongy bone. Spongy bone has more fatty tissues, has a higher conductivity, and we showed that those areas are kind of like preferential pathways for current entering the head. Also ventricles, white matter and gray matter. So we can also just then show one of the surfaces, for example, just the gray matter. Another one. So the simulation results will then look a bit different. So if we have created a head model, so we have basically automated pipeline, we just pass the anatomical images to that. And then to specify the coil position, for example, for TMS, you can just then click somewhere on the head and specify that. So, merge me the coil. So yeah, that's then simulation results. So that would be for the case for TMS now. You have like specified the coil somewhere. What you see here is now basically the magnetic field. Then you can also show, yeah, like then the potential distribution that would be here. So the electric field is there, the gradient, the potential. So if you then have the gradient here, so that would be then the distribution, and then yeah, just basically in the norm of the electric field. So that would be now on the skin. Of course, that is kind of more, say, what I look first, just to check whether the simulation gives reasonable results. But of course, you're then like more interested in just what's happening in the brain. So yeah, so that would be then basically what it looks more, the electric field distribution on the brain. So there are like some typical effects. So it's like there are like a lot of modeling studies. So one typical thing is you see the coil what had like the current was like in this direction. And what you then can see here is like then areas that were basically aligned or perpendicular to the current direction get like stronger electric fields. And this is like a physical effect that occurs if the current has to pass the cerebrospinal fluid before entering the gray matter. This leads to an enhancement in electric field strength. This is just because in physics you have the law of current preservation, and just the amount of current that flows in has to come out basically. You know, you don't lose any current, and yeah, the electric field is current times conductivity. Like the current is like conductivity times electric field, and one like domain in CSF is about like 5 times higher conducting that, and then the gray matter, and that kind of causes those effects. So a lot of, and what is like also known, for example, for the motor cortex, there's a strong dependency on coil orientation. So how you orient your coil, that matters, determines strongly how, for example, how strong the finger twitches. And there's like one direction that is supposedly known optimal for motor cortex stimulation, and that kind of coincides basically also with the orientation that leads to the strongest electric field. So at the motor cortex, we have this big advantage that with this direct measurable output, MEPs, but for example, now here that was for dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is like, say, the other big target in TMS, what is, for example, used in depression. There we don't have a directly measurable output signal, and there maybe like those simulation can help to determine optimal positions to maximize the field strength in a certain brain region. So yeah, that's basically what we can do with TMS, and maybe go back to the talk.
No, just having.
So yeah, that's basically you can see here then also on lower right then the anisotropy. We had a couple of studies where we validated this with motor evoked potentials. I don't really want to get in this. We also had a possibility to do this in tumor patients where they then can stimulate it before and then before they have surgery and then directly stimulate on the cortex. Direct cortical stimulation also show that they kind of give with the gold standard direct cortical stimulation that leads to high overlap with what you can do with TMS. What we are also working on now is combining that with functional connectivity, not only say the electric field is kind of like the anatomical region that you're targeting, but then also further looking which function networks might be involved and use, for example, function network derived from resting fMRI for optimized targeting. For example, if you take the electric field and as a seed region. So that was a kind of current work. Then quickly a bit for TDCS, we already saw this model there. It depends with TMS and TDCS, there are like some slight differences in terms of model accuracy. For TMS, the magnetic field basically passes the skull more or less unhindered, and like exact skull modeling is not important. Really for TMS, it's really only about, say, the cerebrospinal fluid and gray matter. That is good, then your model results will probably like give you a good result. For TDCS, it's a bit more tricky, and there are a lot more factors that play a role. So we have to have more, say, precise models actually. Yeah, that is like a typical example of what you see for TDCS about current flow. So here's like from one electrode, like a lot of it's like the current is like shunted in the skin. It's higher conducting, not everything is entering the brain. And there are then those regions where we have a thin skull. A lot of it's like entering the brain. And what is actually a main determinant where you stimulate with TDCS is finally the layer of CSF between the skull and the gray matter. And in those areas, you only have a thin CSF layer, you have high electric fields. You can imagine it because the CSF is like, say, like the highest conducting medium in the head, and it transports the current away all over the place. And if there's only a little bit, it doesn't really have much of a choice than to enter the brain at this point. There are other approaches for TDCS that basically based on modeling that to try to focalize electric fields a little bit more, to use multiple electrodes that leads them to, say, much more focal electric field. What you can do is like also then use with the whole EEG-like cap, they individually stimulate each of those electrodes. Are now also commercially available. So for example, at the NKI, we have like an 8-channel stimulator where we can control each of the 8 input channels and try them to optimize the electric field a little bit more. So that's what we're also working on now at the NKI to further validate FEM models with direct recordings. So we have CBIS monkeys which have implanted electrodes, and here what you see here is like that's like an electrode with like 5 mm spacing in each of those contacts. You can measure the potential distribution, and then also have externally applied stimulation electrodes and basically directly measure the field distribution. So that's what you see here is like the direct measurement during experiment, and so that will be the predicted result from the simulation, and so a correlation. It seems like those simulation results are actually pretty good in predicting the electric field distribution. What we're also working on now is to directly validate those multi-stimulation approaches. So you can, of course, do FEM models for monkey as well. It's a bit more difficult to generate them in the first place, but then once you have it, you have it. And then also use then via multi-electrode stimulation, see what happens if you kind of use a monitor to supposedly bias the field in one direction and then directly measure and validate it. I think that's what I wanted to show from the talk. Maybe you can still go back to the demo, show you a little bit more. So that was for TMS. That should be a result. I think that should be for TDCS, and you can also have a look what that looks like. So yeah, the whole software is basically all is based on free software. For example, for image segmentation, it uses FreeSurfer and FSL, and then
What's this viewer program?
So that is like a view called Gmesh. So that's actually really nice. So view that's like both for the FEM generation and computation, but also the post-processing capabilities are pretty cool that you can nearly visualize anything that you want. So yeah, that was here now an example for TDCS. So for example, if you had anode somewhat, so the anode was somewhere close on the skin here on that side and the cathode here. So that's like the potential, right? So positive to negative. And then electric field kind of looks like this. You kind of have high electric fields close to the electrodes. What is like also very common is that near the edges of the electrodes, so they're kind of looking in the direction of the other electrodes, they get like highest electric fields because they basically have like the steepest drop off in the voltage, so they have like highest electric fields there. So yeah, that's so the electric field is of course like a vector quantity, so it's like a little arrow.
Do you have models for an inflated brain?
Yeah, you can just use this, write it into, for example, FreeSurfer, use FreeSurfer to inflate and round it back. So if you look one that like have used this in a couple of papers, yeah, especially, yeah, sometimes it's like really interesting to see where you are, that like on top of the gyro crowns, it's somewhere in the south side, and then just blow it up.
Is it biased towards the gyro crowns?
In general, yes. For TMS, it's more like decreasing with steps. Although there's come a big discussion actually where like the effective parts are for TMS, whether it's on the gyro crown, which the electric field is strongest. But other people are more claiming it's more deeper in the south side because there the pyramidal neurons are potentially oriented with the electric field, so don't really know. Yeah. I guess the last thing maybe could also can show you possibly the monkey model that we have. Have we lost those guys?
No, it's okay.
So yeah, so what helps to have like, so that would be now model from a monkey. Just shows a skull. Monkey skull, for example. So yeah, basically you can do whatever you want in terms of visualization. In combination, you can also just display. You just can display scalar entities, vectors, even tensors. In combination with models, you can now integrate also imaging from fMRI. I guess that was about it, what I wanted to show you. there any questions from the audience or somewhere else?
So your segmentation, like this is a monkey, and also I noticed that in the human, the skull does not have anything for the lower part, right?
Yeah, so exactly. Yeah.
So if I have a segmentation with the skull, like in the lower part, will that also work in your software?
Yeah, I mean, you can always so what we did, because it's kind of started for TMS, which is then usually only the upper part of the head, we just basically cut off the neck in the MR image. Makes it a bit easier. But yeah, I have also a model where the full neck, because sometimes you have like people putting a reference electrode on the shoulder, so I have that, so it's possible.
So,
But basically, you just have to like, yeah, comment out one line of code where we have this cutting, basically. But it just works, like the segmentation works a bit better if we kind of, cut the head a little bit. Good.
okay.
But yeah.
So if I have that segmentation including the whole skull.
Yeah, so basically, yeah. So, I mean, how it all works, basically, you have first like segmentation mask and volume MR space, and then you create a surface mesh based on those, and then you create a FEM model. Like those, so if you have those volume masks, yeah, you can just use them to run just that part that creates the FEM mesh.
I remember you told me each layer of tissue, like the layer of skin, must contain the layer of skull.
Yeah, so
and also the skull should contain CSF and so on.
Yeah, that's one for the FEM. It's like important that there's no overlap between those surfaces. So, and that surface are like have certain geometrical quality measures. So, for example, we use the gray matter and white matter surface from free surfer, but they have not say a numerical quality that you can create an FEM model. So you basically have to then uniform the triangulation and change that, and you have to make sure that the surfaces are decoupled. That means that they are not overlying triangles, so that you have like a basically well-defined domain. So that's those prerequisite. What's that?
Air cavities.
Yeah, we have in this one. We had in the very first that we showed, we had it there, but it's not what we usually say automatically would say. But sure, yeah, it depends like kind of what kind of application you're looking forward to, what kind of say detail you have. Like the more details, of course, you add, the more say complicated or error prone also gets it, the more say like manual intervention might be needed. So if you run like a large study, so for the latest paper, we actually did a modeling study and used like the data from the Human Cornicome project. And that worked actually really well with the software, because they has then their anatomical images, and like, they process it basically without any errors. So once if you have high quality MR data, it usually works very, very well.
Okay. The other question I have is I noticed that in your slides you did some validation work on the brain with a tumor.
Yes.
So
how we did this?
How's the results for that?
So what we did there is basically there's like a so-called motor mapping experiment with TMS, where you place a TMS coil at a different position on the skin and measure motor evoked potentials for every position. And then you can get the so-called motor map, which was like this color-coded basically where you get the strongest motor evoked potentials, and like which is right over M1 usually. And then if you move further apart, then the field at M1 gets, of course, weaker and then basically completely disappears. So you kind of create this map, and then you would create also a similar map with direct cortical stimulation. Before they resect the tumors, they also want to know where's like the important motor areas, that they don't make a cut to those motor areas. And so they have like a little stimulation electrode, which is directly put on the cortex and also stimulate, and then also see basically where the finger twitches. And say basically those predicted areas where it's like the main motor representation based say on the gold standard of direct cortical stimulation based on what we would predict from TMS or from the modeling part, they overlap to pretty well extended. For example, had a higher overlap than say a spherical model, which is still commonly used in many, say, neural navigation software. It even commercially available that have also like FDA approval for pre-surgical motor mapping.
Oh, Alex, actually, I have another question. So I was curious about your TMS and TACS models. How do you account for frequency-dependent material properties? It's like an average value or something, or I've heard some groups do that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, so in the model, you can just set conductivity values. So it's just like one part. So of course, they are just using standard values from literature that more or less everyone uses. So for TMS is a different frequency range than TACS. For example, TMS is like in, let's say, 4 and 5 kilohertz main frequency that has a little bit different conductivity dependence than say for TACS, say like 1 hertz or 5 hertz. So you can adapt for this. But what I also have to say, those measured literature values are also not really well known, or like, but not every studies are, on those they are based are not the best ones. So what we then usually, what you should do in a modeling study is that you just simulate over a broad range and see whether your results are stable. So that's what we did in a lot of those modeling studies. But usually I would say it doesn't matter that much as long as, say, the ratios between, say, cerebrospinal fluid and brain are kind of kept constant. If they don't really change it, then the qualitative results will basically be not affected, determine whether you now use a little different connectivity. And also we are measuring those a bit now on the monkeys too. And actually it seems like that they at least say on what the normal, say from 1 to 100 hertz, that they don't change so much. It's only like 10% change. So, but sure, I completely agree that you need a lot of validation, and it's always like a model, and you have to make sure a model is always wrong, but sometimes might be useful.
Another question about your model.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find any cases where you need to use the anisotropic conductivity?
Yeah, I think it's more like kind of a cool thing than like a necessary feature. So that was like one of the very first things that I showed, like how large is the influence of anisotropy, whether you use it or not. And for, say, cortical region, it doesn't really matter. But for deeper targets that are close to white matter, then it makes a difference. So it kind of depends what you're interested in, but like just say for the say localization of, say, cortical hotspot, that's
Right.
hard. So yeah.
So I'm interested in deep brain stimulation, and we're definitely wondering about whether or not we should.
I think for that might be more important actually, right? Than the electrodes, like very close to.
Like a millimeter makes a big difference.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like your model.
I think it really always depends a bit on the physical problem. What you look at, what has an influence, what hasn't. For example, as I said, the example of the skull. Now for TMS, that's why I also like TMS, that the skull doesn't really matter so much. It makes it easier to go for others.
All right, guys, I think we need to start wrapping it up now. Okay, Cameron, we've finished here. We're going to end the broadcast.
I'm sorry about that. I was just wondering, are there any questions here? Well, thank y'all very much, Alex. That was wonderful. I guess we'll see y'all later.
Yep.
All right, have a nice day. Here, we'll give you. All right, thank y'all very much. We'll see y'all later. Okay.